Chapter 6. December arrived with heavy clouds, black as oil, that gathered for days over the village before finally releasing their rain. All across the district, farmers did their best to plant seed for the next harvest, yet many were so busy looking for food that their fields went unsowed. Our family was fortunate that we were able to plant a small crop of maize. We also managed to plant half an acre of tobacco, which would be a lifesaver in months to come. Each day while I was weeding the fields, I'd see the Waganu moving slowly down the road searching for piecework, their clothes soaked with rain and covered in mud. Working for food was becoming harder now that the price of maize at the market was increasing every day. 3 hours of work yesterday became 6 hours today, all for the same bag of flour. The Waganu and others continued to gather at the home of Chief Wimbe, who they knew would have extra food in storage, for the chief's maize fields were huge and planted with plenty of fertilizer. It became Gilbert's job to greet the hungry people and help his mother pass out fala at the back door. After he'd served one person, a new one would appear. "Odie, Odie," they'd say, "anyone here?" "Another one," said Gilbert, "this one worse than before." Each day, as they left Gilbert's and continued down the road towards our house, I imagined my father and me walking beside them, heads towards the ground, scouring the soil. I feared it wouldn't be long. Back at home, our food was nearly gone. Just the previous day, my mother had milled our last pail of grain, and I knew that meant only 12 more meals. When she'd gone, I opened the storage door and peered inside. The empty sack sat in the corner like a pile of dirty clothes for the wash. I tried to imagine what the room had looked like when it was full, when our lives had been normal, and fear didn't live inside us. But I couldn't summon the energy to remember. That night, my father called us together in the living room. "Given our situation," he said, "I've decided it's better if we go down to one meal per day. It's the only way we'll make it." My sisters and I understood, but still argued over the fine points. "If we have one meal a day, when should it be?" asked Annie. "Breakfast," said Aisha. "I like lunch," shouted Doris. "No," my father said, "it will be supper. It's easier to keep your mind off hunger during the day, but no person should try to sleep with an empty stomach. We'll eat at night." So starting the next evening, we ate our single meal of the day. Again, my father gathered us all in the living room, making it the first time we'd ever eaten together as a family. In our Chiwa culture, at least in the village, the daughter never eats with the father, and the son never eats with the mother. It's not considered polite. What if you pass gas in front of your mother? As early as I remember, I'd always eaten with my father and uncles, while my mother fed my sisters in a separate room. In our culture, family life follows many rules that have been passed down by our ancestors. Family relations aren't like they are in America, where daughters hug their fathers and sons hug their mothers. If people saw such a thing in the village, they'd wonder, where are their morals? And children respect their elders of the opposite sex, no matter what. For instance, if I called my younger sister over and held out 100 kwacha note saying, "Run quickly to the shop and get some bread," she'd bow to one knee before taking it. It's like that. So that night, in the living room, my father and I sat on the floor with my sisters. A needle can filled with kerosene flickered at the end of the wooden table, sending black soot spiraling through the humidity. My mother came in carrying a basin of warm water and a pitcher for hand washing, which was done before and after every meal. My sister Doris went around to each person, holding the basin under their hands while pouring the other. When the hand washing was finished, my mother fetched a large bowl, then lifted the lid. "Try to make it last," she said, then joined us on the floor. Instead of the mountain of sema cakes I was so accustomed to, the bowl contained only one gray blob. It didn't even look like food. Another bowl nearby contained some mustard greens. Soon, the smell found our nostrils, and we passed the blob from one person to the next, picking it apart like a yard full of hens. We didn't even bother using plates. The way I calculated it, each person got 7 mouthfuls of food. We finished the sema in minutes and ate mostly in silence, happy that at least we were chewing something. But there were no signs of happiness on my parents' faces. In fact, I'd never seen them so terrified in all my life. You see, The week before we ran out of food, on November 22nd, my mother had given birth to another baby girl. If our culture demanded that children respect their elders, it also forbade us from asking questions, especially about things concerning the body. I'd noticed my mother getting fatter for months, but didn't dare say a thing. When a woman gets pregnant in the village, it becomes taboo, an open secret never to be discussed. Only the woman's husband and mother can ask her about her growing belly. And if a child was overheard even mentioning this aloud, he or she would surely be beaten. Talking about a pregnant woman was not only none of your business, but people believed it also left her open to a kind of bewitching. Many pregnant women simply stayed indoors until the baby was born. When the youngsters asked where their new brother or sister came from, the parents would say, "The clinic, where all children are bought." So when my parents came home with a new baby girl, my young sisters jumped with excitement, knowing they too had been purchased at the clinic. But my parents seemed too worried to even entertain their questions. For days, my new sister didn't even have a name. In the villages, where health care is poor, many children die early of malnutrition, malaria, or diarrhea. In hungry times, the situation is always worse. Because of this, names often reflect the circumstances or the parents' greatest fears. It's quite sad, but all across Malawi, you'll run into men and women named such things as Simkalista, I'm dying anyway; Malazani, finish me off; Maliro, funeral; Manda, tombstone; or Felantuni, kill me quickly, all of whom had fortunately outwitted their unfortunate names. Many change their names once they're older, like my father's older brother. My grandparents named him Dzmange, which means suicide. He later changed it to Musaiwale, meaning don't forget. Despite the stress my parents were facing, my sister was born healthy, 6 pounds 2 ounces. Whether it was due to her good health or a kind of blind faith as we entered a famine, my parents named her Tia Maike, which means thank God. With only half a pail of flour remaining, I knew it wouldn't be long before we'd join the Waganyu and began roaming the land. We needed some kind of miracle, or at least a good idea. The next morning my father announced a brilliant plan, a gamble, a roll of the bones even riskier than magic. "We're selling all our food," he said. That same morning my mother took our last bit of flour, mixed it with soy and a bit of sugar, and began baking zigmungu cakes to sell in the market. The plan was to jump-start a small business, take advantage of the scarcity, and live on the profits, if there were any. All day the smell of sweet cakes filled our compound, invading every room and drifting out into the fields. Several people stopped in the road, maybe hoping for something, and just took in the aroma. Even the birds became brave and gathered in the yard to sing a woeful tune. The smell seemed to enter my body like a spirit, slithering into my empty belly and stretching its legs, using its elbows to get comfortable. It was torture. Normally, my mother let me take the bowl and scrape the remaining batter with my fingers. Leftovers were so cherished that we kids had even given them a name, VP, after Vapasi pot, meaning the bottom of the pot. We'd appear in the courtyard as my mother was preparing to wash the pot, or give the scraps to the chicken, saying, "Mama, VP." But this time was different. My mother had scraped away every last drop to use, as if wiping it clean with a sponge. No VP, only the bare pot. That night my father built a crude stall from a broken table and an iron sheet, and he and my mother positioned it in the front of Ipunga barber shop. The next morning my mother opened for business, selling her cakes for 3 kwacha each. The cakes were heavy and filling, and cheaper than the buns and walkmen that were also for sale. If a person had just some small change, but not enough to afford a bag of flour, the cakes were the only option. Some days my mother sold out in less than 20 minutes. Ever since the country had run out of maize, businessmen in the trading center had been crossing the border into Tanzania and buying it by the ton, then marking it up to sell. One of these traders, Mr. Mangachi, was an old friend of my father's. With the money my mother earned from selling cakes, my father cut a deal with Bangachi and bought 1 pail of maize. My mother took it to the mill, saved half the flour for us, and used the rest for more cakes. We did this every day, taking enough to eat and selling the rest. It was enough to provide our one blob of sema each night, along with some pumpkin leaves. It was practically nothing, yet knowing it would be there somehow made the hunger less painful. As long as we can stay in business, my father said, we'll make it through. Our profit is that we live. On a Sunday morning not long after, when my mother was home preparing her things to sell, she noticed something odd. 2 young men on bicycles were standing in our yard talking with my older sister Annie. My mother had never seen them before, and since my sisters weren't allowed to speak to boys without permission, she went over to investigate. Mama, these are 2 teachers from the private school in Mututama, Annie said. They've come to visit one of their friends down the road. Annie asked if she could escort them. Annie attended the secondary school just across from a private school, so my mother suspected they all knew one another. She agreed, thinking nothing of it, and went off to the trading center. At the time, my father was visiting a friend at a nearby estate, and since it was Sunday, the rest of us had gone to the market. Only my sister Doris, who was 9 years old, stayed behind to take care of the house. When my mother returned home that afternoon, she discovered that nothing had been done to prepare supper. "Why isn't there a fire made?" she asked Doris. "Where's your sister?" "She went with the men." "She's still not back yet?" Doris shrugged her shoulders. That night when my father returned home, he asked where Annie was. My mother said she didn't know. She didn't want to tell him about the boys, hoping Annie would just come home before it got any later. But after supper, when Annie still hadn't returned, my father asked again. This time he seemed angry. "Where is my daughter?" "I don't know." "Of course you know. You're her mother. Now tell me, please, I don't know." My mother became so worried she took her torch and went looking on the roads. She asked the neighbors, the people coming from the market, but no one had seen Annie. After some hours, she came home in tears and confronted Doris again. "What did you see? Where did they go?" Frightened, Doris then told my mother the truth. Just before Annie left with the 2 young men, she had packed a bag. Annie told Doris not to tell. My mother rushed into Annie's room and saw that all her clothing was gone, along with her school bag. The only thing left behind was her school uniform and books. Turning, my mother noticed something sticking out from Tiamake's diaper bag, which she kept in Annie's room. It was a note written in Chichewa. "I got married to the teacher. I'm safe. Don't worry." My father came into the room and my mother read the note aloud. When he heard this, he flew into a rage. "Who is this man?" "I don't know." "Tell me right now who he is. I'll go and find him." "I don't know who he is." You could hear my father stomping up and down the yard, his nostrils flaring like an angry ox. I didn't dare leave my room, for fear he'd whip me just for being there. "You're lying. You're hiding her from me. Where is my daughter? Go and get my daughter back. You know where she is." "I told you I don't know," my mother said. Annie had just passed her Form 2 exam and was preparing to enter her junior year in high school. My parents had been so proud, bragging to all the relatives and traders in the market. It was common for my father to sit my sisters down and tell him things like, "I saw a girl working in the bank in town, and she was a girl just like you." My parents had never completed primary school. They couldn't speak English or even read that well. My parents only knew the language of numbers, buying and selling, but they wanted more for their kids. That's why my father had scraped money together and kept Annie in school, despite the famine and other troubles. Now she was gone, without even saying goodbye. "I've lost my daughter and all my money," my father cried. "My daughter is a stupid girl. Wait until I find her." But he knew it was too late. He knew Annie was probably staying with her lover that night. Even if the arrangement failed and they didn't get married, my sister had dirtied herself and shamed our family. She could never live at home again, and this crushed my father's heart. The man Annie married was a teacher named Mike. They'd met in Mutama months before and had fallen in love. Mike had actually visited the day before without anyone seeing and told my sister, "I'm coming here to pick you up. I don't want you living in this village anymore." the friend had come along as a ruse and taken the bag ahead. That way, no one would suspect anything if they saw Mike and my sister together. The two hid for the night at the friend's house at Estate 34, and then went to Mike's home in Nichiti the following morning. In a normal courtship, if a girl likes a guy enough, she'll ask him to come meet her family. He'll then visit for several weekends in a row. If all goes well and the guy senses he's safe with the family, he'll propose marriage. The girl will say, "Okay, let me talk with my uncle." The girl will then speak to her mother about the matter. The mother will talk to the father, who will speak to his wife's brother. The uncle then approaches the groom's uncle and the two men convene. The bride's uncle then names the price of the dowry, usually money, anywhere upwards of 100,000 kwacha, or livestock, such as a cow. The bride's uncle will also be given a mouth fee for speaking on behalf of his family. All of this happens before the wedding is even planned. In addition to the dowry, the groom's family also pays for the ceremony and reception. All the food, drinks, transport, spending big if he's any kind of bwana. For a man, weddings are expensive, which explains why there are so many young single men in Malawi. My sister Annie's fiance did none of this. 3 weeks after she disappeared, my father received a letter from Mike's parents informing my parents of the marriage and how the couple planned to stay in the Chitsi. It then gave instructions on where to collect the dowry, just a few hundred kwacha, of which only half arrived. It would be more than a year before we heard from my sister again. My father's spirit seemed to disappear in the days after my sister left. He was no longer his upbeat, optimistic self, and his laughter was noticeably missing from the compound, as if the wind had come along and stolen one of our houses. He seemed to grow increasingly quiet and sullen, which did little to help our confidence in the face of looming hunger. We were all upset about Annie, but what we didn't admit was that her absence now meant a little more food. With her gone, each person got an extra mouthful at supper. About a week later, my mother was coming home from selling cakes in the trading center when a 30-ton lorry passed her on the road. Its load was covered in tarps. A few traders nearby said it was full of maize and headed for the Admark in Chamama. When my mother got home, she told us the news and called me over. "You will go to Chamama tomorrow. Leave as early as possible." Chamama was 15 kilometers away, so of course I grumbled. "Are you positive it was maize, not fertilizer? Because are you listening to me, boy? You go tomorrow." My mother was right. This was great news. Maize was now selling for 800 kwacha a pail in the trading center and was sure to increase even more in the coming months. If we could get it cheaper at the Admark, then the extra bag or two would help us a great deal, but it didn't really matter. The trails were full of people going in the same direction. All of us carried empty flour sacks. "Chamama," I shouted. "Eh," they answered. The Admark was located in the center of Chamama's trading center, along a gravel road amid a row of white one-story storefronts. The building itself was white with blue trim along the windows, housed behind a wire fence and surrounded by metal sheds that normally held all the grain. I couldn't believe what I saw when I got there. The line stretched from the doors of Admark all the way down the road, as long as a soccer pitch at least. One line was for men, the other for women, and each became longer by the minute. I parked my bike against the fence and went and took my place. At 6:15 a.m. the sky was still a bit dark. The weather was cool and pleasant, and people seemed in good spirits. But once the scorching sun rose in the sky, I suddenly became aware of how devastating the hunger was for everyone. All around me people appeared weak and exhausted, as if they hadn't slept. The skin around their cheeks was shrunken, and their eyes were pinched against the light. They probably hadn't eaten much in weeks, and I suspected the Admark was their only salvation. If things went badly for them here, they probably wouldn't get any better. As the air became thicker and hotter, they began to wilt like potted plants in the sun. An old man in front of me could hardly stay awake. His hands trembled as if he was cold, and his breathing was heavy. When the line advanced a step, his body couldn't follow, and he collapsed to the ground. To my horror, the crowd simply stepped over him. In the next line, babies cried, and wailed from hunger, and children tugged on their mothers' dresses, begging for breakfast. If there's anything I remember most about that day in Chamama, it's the sound of crying babies. As the morning dragged on, people began selling their places in line. These men had no money, but they had arrived around 3 a.m. and secured a good spot in line. As they neared the building, they turned to the person behind them and said, "Hey, hold my place, eh?" Then walked to the back of the line. They found the person shaking most from hunger, the man whose eyes were dim and dancing in their sockets, and told him, "I'm 10 minutes from the door. You can have my spot in exchange for a little maize on your way out." People jumped at the offer. This happened all day. That morning my mother had dipped into her inventory and given me a cake for the journey, which had sat like a stone in my empty stomach. But after many hours in line I became very hungry and weak myself. The heat from the other bodies was like being surrounded in fire. People began smelling bad, and my head felt like a plastic jumbo, caught in the wind and drifting into the sun. Even my fingers were sweating. As we inched closer to the door, people became impatient and began pushing. They simply couldn't wait any longer. Someone pushed me so hard from behind that I had to grab hold of the man in front of me just to keep from falling down. Soon people began running from the back and squeezing in front, twisting and squirming into the line like mice under a door. "Hey, stop cutting!" people screamed, the hunger straining their voices. "We woke up with the first cock. We've been here all day." But people still kept coming. Everyone knew there was only one truck of grain, and it would run out eventually. The more people cut in line, the more others panicked. Both lines mobbed the front doors. The wave of bodies surged behind me, pinning me against the man in front. I couldn't breathe. I planted my feet to keep from falling, but when I leaned sideways for some air, no more than 3 inches, the man behind me tumbled forward and sparked a chain reaction. 4 men collapsed on top of him, causing a great crash of knees and elbows. Once the dam had broken, the crowd rushed over them to fill the empty space. As the mob swallowed me again, a strange thing happened. Everything went quiet. The screams and moaning of children fell away, along with my own fear. I looked out through the tangle of faces, fingers, and teeth, and saw my great reward. The Admark building lay just ahead, only a few short meters away. A shallow rain ditch circled the building like a castle moat, and in my misery, that ditch became the great river Jordan. There I was, standing atop the mountain, peering into the promised land. All I had to do was make it across the water. 20 minutes later, with a few more surges of the crowd, I felt my feet clear the distance. A second later I was inside. The Admark office was quiet and peaceful, and the air suddenly became cool and fresh. Ahead of me I saw a hill of maize as high as my waist, more food than I'd seen in months. The sight was intoxicating. But just as I stepped inside, I heard more commotion near the door where I had just been standing. 2 workers now stood before the crowd and made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," one said, "we're sorry, but we only have 10 bags left." The crowd didn't wait for him to finish. The riot I'd just escaped now exploded into one giant fight. Men used their fists to claw their way forward. I saw a woman fall to the ground and vanish. Another man was dragged to the dirt and trampled. Men just near the door, several women carrying infants jumped out of line to avoid being crushed. These women had been there since sunrise, but by pulling themselves out of the fracas, they also lost their places. I watched them walk away with nothing, wondering if they'd make it through the month. Turning away from the violence outside, I realized it was now my turn in line. I had 400 kwacha in my pocket. It was enough to buy 25 kilograms of maize, which was the advertised limit. But now, at the seller's table, I was told I could only purchase 20. The price remained the same. "How much do you want?" the man asked. 20. He gave me a ticket and pointed down the line. At the other end, workers used metal pails to scoop the maize. The men looked muscular and healthy, nothing like the people outside. The worker who measured my maize then cheated me. He filled my pail very quickly, then tossed it to the scale, causing the needle to bounce wildly from one end to the next. Before it could settle, he whipped it off and emptied it into my sack. Next. But wait, you didn't. If you don't like it, you can leave your maze here. There are plenty of people behind you. Next. With little else to do, I handed him my money, grabbed my maze, and ran for the door, as if I'd just robbed the place. Despite being cheated, I felt like I was on top of the world, the jackpot winner. But my joy quickly turned to fear as I stepped outside into the mob. A man rushed towards me, shouting, "I'll give you 500 for that." Another one pushed him aside. "No, boy, I'll give you 600." I pretended not to listen, concentrated only on strapping the bag to my bike and getting away. The next person could easily just beat me and steal my food. Once I reached the road, I never stopped pedaling. Later, we heard there were riots at other Admark buildings across Malawi, where several children fell from their mothers' backs and were trampled. At home, my sisters and parents welcomed me back like a hero from the war. I must have looked exhausted, and my clothes were stretched and dirty. I tossed the bag onto my father's scale, and confirmed I'd been robbed. I'd only received 15 kilos of maize, half a bag, but at least that would feed us for another week. Soon after I returned from Chamama, people began selling their possessions. Standing on the porch one morning during a heavy rain, I watched a line of people walking slowly past like a great army of ants. They were our neighbors and farmers from other villages. The women carried large basins atop their head containing the items for their kitchens, all their pots and pans, water buckets, and even bundles of clothing. A man carried a chicken under each arm. Goats were bound by the leg with a vine, crying and baying as they were dragged through the mud. Men balanced sofas, chairs, and tables across their backs and shoulders, their heads bent and faces twisted under the weight. They stopped to rest every few meters, exhausted from hunger, before hoisting their heavy loads and carrying on. At my feet, Kama lay spread out on the ground, lazily flipping his tail at the flies that had sought shelter under the porch. He was growing even thinner. Our one meal a day didn't include my dog, and some days I was forced to eat what I'd normally give him. I felt so guilty that most of the time I tried to avoid him completely. But this morning he'd found me, and together we watched the people on the road. They all seemed to be in a great rush to get somewhere, to unload these worldly items and put something in their stomachs. They hardly seemed to notice the rain, which had become so heavy their bodies blurred into watery spirits. I waited for the rain to taper off, then followed them down the muddy trail to the trading center. The raining season normally doesn't deter the market women, who stand out all day under giant umbrellas and never get wet. But today their wooden stalls in the market were empty. Many of the shops along the main road were also shuttered. But this was no ghost town. As a light shower fell, the market women and most everyone else now crammed into the main road looking for food. Most normal, everyday trading was now being replaced with the business of survival. Usually people who wanted to sell their positions would spread out tarpaulins to display what they had, but now they walked from person to person saying, "Nidiri, Nindi, Malanda, I've got something to sell. How about this radio? It's yours for a giveaway price." Those carrying furniture weren't able to squeeze under the awnings for shelter, and the rain soaked the tables and sofas on their backs. But still they continued on. "Don't worry about the water," said a man with a nervous grin. "This is hardwood. It won't ruin it. You'll have this chair into your old years. How much do you have? I'll take anything. My children need to eat." A few of the businessmen, like Mr. Mangochi, bought things they later gave back, but most people had no money. They simply shrugged and shook their heads. Crowds now gathered around the few traders who were selling imported maize. The prices were so high that the traders were practically regarded as criminals. "You people are thieves," people shouted. "Who's setting these prices? You're killing our children." Soon people began selling the iron sheets off their homes for a cup of flour, and their thatched roofs for even less. "What good is a roof when I'm dead?" one man asked. A man in the trading center was caught trying to sell his two young daughters. The buyer had informed the police. People were becoming desperate. By now the December rains had caused the grass to grow very high by the roadsides, and since people were becoming weak or were out looking for food, the grass went untrimmed. The tall grass made a perfect hiding place for thieves, and soon women were being attacked and robbed as they left the maize mill. One morning as I walked home along the mill, I saw a young mother standing alone, sobbing. The crime had just occurred. "My children are waiting," she cried. "What am I going to do?" A few other women appeared and tried to console her. "We know your kids are crying at home," they said. "Just send your husband next time." "Next time," the young mother replied. "There may not be a next time." The mountain was getting higher for everyone. Inside the maize mill, the owners no longer had any use for a broom. The hungry people kept the floors cleaner than a wet mop. At the beginning of the month, the mill was packed full of those waiting for fallen scraps. The crowd would part long enough to allow women to pass with their pails of grain. As the machine rumbled and spit a white cloud of flour into the pails, the multitude of old people, women, and children watched intently, with eyes dancing like butterflies. Once the pail was pulled away, they threw themselves on hands and knees and scooped the floor clean. Afterwards the old women would rattle their walking sticks up inside the grinder as if a ringing bell, collecting the loose flour that drifted on the floor. This activity stopped by mid-December because so few people had any grain to mill anyway. The building remained empty, all except the operator and a few children whose parents had either died or had simply abandoned them to hunger. Normally, Christmas was my favorite day of the year, but of course, this year was far from normal. In better times, we'd celebrate Christmas Eve by attending the Nativity play at the Catholic church down the road, watching Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus try to escape from Herod's soldiers and their wooden swords and AK-47s. It wasn't the most accurate version, but it was funny. After church, we'd feast on delicious flying ants that arrived with each rainy season. The insects would swarm the lights of the trading center at night, then ceremoniously fall to the ground and shed their white wings. But since we kids weren't allowed out after dark, my sisters would build a large grass fire behind the house, then catch the ants in basins of water as they fell. The drowned ants were then roasted on a flat pan and doused with salt. Roasted ants taste like chewy dried onions and stuck nicely to a ball of sema. When eaten along with beans and pumpkin leaves, they were truly heavenly. On Christmas morning, breakfast wouldn't consist of challah, but sliced brown bread, soft and moist. If we had extra money for other luxuries such as Blue Band margarine, sugar, and powdered milk, I'd press several pieces of bread together into a buttery sandwich, then wash it down with a mug of steaming Chamama tea. Fresh bread and Blue Band mixed with sweet and milky tea is one of the best combinations you can ever put into your mouth. Malawians' desire for meat is especially strong at Christmas. If you go all year without eating meat, hopefully on Christmas Day you can manage a little something. So in the early afternoon on Christmas Day, my father would kill one of our chickens. Christmas chicken isn't served with sema, not today, but with rice. Ask any Malawian to talk about Christmas and he'll always mention the rice. But Christmas of 2001 arrived more like a punishment. First of all, the week before the holidays, most of our chickens got Newcastle disease, which paralyzed them, made them unable to eat, and finally killed them. Only one chicken managed to survive, and I'm telling you, she was very lonely. The Catholic Church canceled the Nativity service, and the Presbyterians didn't even bother making an announcement. But no one showed up. And with everyone so hungry and getting weaker, my sisters couldn't even muster the energy to catch flying ants. On Christmas morning there was no fresh bread or Blue Band waiting on the table, no tea with milk and sugar, no chicken for supper, and certainly not any rice. There was no breakfast at all. I woke up, washed my mouth, and heard the sounds of Silent Night coming from the radio in my sister's room. When the song ended, the young DJ came on, sounding very energetic. "Hey, here's wishing all of you a very Merry Christmas," he said. "Easy to say when you're in Blantyre, working for the government," I said, then grabbing my hoe and headed for the fields. anything to keep from hearing more about Christmas. Around noon, my mother did manage to serve a Christmas lunch, but it was just our usual blob of sema and a spoonful of pumpkin leaves. She'd probably worked very hard to save that much flour to give us an extra meal, but it was hard to feel festive. I finished my last bite and was still hungry. I then went to see Geoffrey, which turned out to be even more depressing. I walked into his room and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, looking exhausted. Ever since Geoffrey's mom had milled their last pail of maize back in November, he had become one of the Wiganu who wandered the land looking for piecework. He'd been fortunate to find jobs pulling weeds and bunking ridges in the traders' fields near the Dambo. I could see that his anemia was still bothering him, and he was losing weight. "Hey, man," I said, "I haven't seen you in days. Your field is full of weeds. They're taking over." "Too busy with Ganyu," he said. "At first, I went out looking for food for the month, then the week. Now it's all about tomorrow. How can I tend my fields when I can't even eat tomorrow?" I wanted to help him, but what could I do? I hadn't seen Gilbert in a few days, so I walked down to his house. It was creepy along the trail. Usually on Christmas you hear the sounds of music or singing and see families dressed in their best clothes laughing as they made their way to the trading center. But the people who walked past today did so slowly, heads down, not even saying hello. About 50 people were scattered under the blue gums outside Gilbert's house when I arrived. The smoke from their cooking fires covered the house in a gray haze. Gilbert was standing in his doorway. "Merry Christmas, eh?" I said. "Not here," he answered, shaking his head. Surely Chief Windbabe will have some delicious chicken and rice, I thought. But Gilbert said no. The non-stop procession of souls to his door had taken most of their supply. "It's only sema and beans here, brother," he said, looking disappointed. "How's your father?" I asked. "He greets people when he's feeling well," he said, "but mostly he sleeps and listens to the radio with his cat." My nose then caught the scent of something terrible on the breeze. It made my lips curl. "What is that?" I said. "Oh, the people aren't even bothering with the latrine anymore. Now they're just defecating in our trees. Be careful where you walk." "Yeah, for sure." With Gilbert busy with the hungry people and Geoffrey not feeling well and doing Ganyu, I went to the clubhouse to see what my cousin Charity was doing. I knocked on the clubhouse door and Charity let me inside. He had a small fire going in the pot. His roommate Mizek was nowhere around. "It's Christmas," he said, "and I haven't eaten a thing." "Yeah," I said, "I'm hungry too." The two of us began thinking of ways to get food. The mangoes were all gone, so we couldn't steal those. The traders in the market wouldn't dare part with any flour, and we weren't hungry enough to crawl outside their shops and dig for stray kernels in the dirt. Not yet, anyway. "We need meat," Charity said. "I can't go to sleep tonight without my Christmas meat." There was a guy named James who ran a mangina near the Canyenya pit where meat is fried. Mangina is the meat from the head and hooves of a cow or goat, basically head cheese. The butcher splits the head into 3 or 4 parts, then tosses them into a pot of boiling water, along with the legs and the hooves. You could come by and eat the tender meat from the leg, or have a bit of boiled brain and tongue. The meat from a cow's cheek is also delicious. Charity and I started dreaming aloud. Perhaps James will be generous on Christmas and let us have some. "Don't be stupid," said Charity. "He'll never do that." He paused for a moment, and then said, "But he does throw away the skins." "Can you eat that?" I asked, twisting my face. "I'm thinking why not? What's the difference? It's all meat, right?" "Yeah, I guess you're right," I said. The hunger had affected our thinking. As we walked to James' stands, I saw that the Kanyenya boys were doing brisk business as usual. Despite the hunger, the wealthy traders were gathered around their stand, chewing on grilled meat, not even swallowing before shoving in a handful of fried chips. A group of villagers were crowded around watching them eat, studying the motions of the traders' hands as they dipped the greasy bits of meat into the salt before popping them into their mouths. Watching them chew, I could feel the salty burn on my own tongue. James's stand was just a bit farther down the road. He was there, as usual, standing above a giant pot boiling on the fire. Getting closer, I could see a delicious goat head and some leg pieces swimming around inside. I wanted to leave immediately. "Hey, James," said Charity, "William and I are making a Christmas drum for the children in the village. Can you part with one of your skins?" James looked up from his pot. "That's a good idea," he said, and then turned around and nodded towards a mound of something on the ground. It was heaped atop a black plastic jumbo and crawling with flies. "I have this goat skin," he said. "I was going to throw it away, but you can take it." Charity quickly threw the skin inside the bag and handed it to me. It was still warm. "Zicomo qua mimbiri," Cheery said. "The kids will appreciate you." "Sure, sure." With our warm goat skin in hand, we hurried back down the hill to Impala. "How are we going to prepare this?" I asked. "It's easy," he said. "We'll do it just like a pig." Back at the clubhouse, I lit a clump of blue gum bark and got the fire started again, then added a few small sticks, since we'd run out of maize pits long before. When the fire was strong and hot, Charity and I held the corners of the skin and stretched it flat over the flames. Soon the heat was singeing the hair, curling it black. Normally this would make a terrible stench, but now, in my hunger, all I smelled was cooking meat. Once the hair charred and curled, we took our knives and scraped it off the hide. We did this again and again until we were sure it was properly cleaned. We cut the skin into small cubes and threw them in a pot of water. For good measure, Charity even made me sneak into my mother's kitchen and steal a handful of soda. "It's how the women make their beans cook faster," he said, "and I'm thinking it works with the skin, too." We let the skin boil for over 2 hours, adding more water, salt, and soda. After 3 hours, a thick white foam had collected on the top. Charity took his knife and fished through the froth, pulling out a piece of steaming hide. It was gray and slimy. Charity blew on it for a few seconds, then shoved it into his mouth. He struggled to chew, his jaws working hard, then finally swallowed. "How is it?" I said, my mouth watering. "A bit tough," he said, "but we're out of firewood. Let's eat." We finished the pieces out of the pot and grabbed them with our fingers. The skin was slimy and sticky, as if covered in scalding glue. I put the first piece in my mouth and breathed it in, feeling the heat of hot food rush into my stomach and lungs. I chewed and chewed. The juice from the skin seeped out of my mouth and caused my lips to stick together. With each chew, my lips sealed shut. "Merry Christmas," I said, struggling to speak. Just then I heard a clawing sound at the door, then a soft whine. I threw open the door and found Kamba. He must have smelled the Christmas meat all the way from my room and came limping over. His bony frame was hunched and tired, but his tail was wagging as fast as ever. I was glad to see him. "Give some to that dog," Charity shouted. "It's dog food we're eating anyway." "For sure," I answered, then turned to Kamba. "Let's get you something to eat, chap. I'm sure you're starving." I tossed up a piece of slimy skin, and to my surprise, Kamba leaped onto his hind legs and caught it in the air, just like old times. "Good boy!" I shouted. It took him 1 second to swallow it whole, and then he licked his lips and waited for more. I went back inside and brought out 2 handfuls of hide. After slurping up every piece, the life seemed to return to his body. He blinked his eyes excitedly and flapped his tail. And making an exception on Christmas, Charity even let Kamba come inside the clubhouse. I lost count of how many pieces I ate myself, but after about half an hour of chewing, Charity and I gave up. Our jaws were too tired and sore to continue. Several large pieces of skin remained in the pot, and I thought about my sisters and parents who were at home, probably hungry and dreaming of meat on this Christmas day, but I didn't dare ask Charity to allow me to share. It was a well-known rule that whatever happened in Impala stayed in Impala. We'd eat the pieces ourselves the next day. As the sun went down that afternoon, we sat around a dead and smoldering fire, content with the warm feeling of meat in our stomachs, because that was what Christmas was all about, anyway.